What is good, everyone? After the previous video, I think I need to give you all a palate cleanser to basically, reset the mood a little bit, because I know some knowledge about the history of West Windsor. And today I'm going to talk about something very good, which is how a lot of South Asians came to call West Windsor, New Jersey, their home. My name is Sanjeev Rajaram, and I'm making this video at the request of this TikTok channel that I've been helping out with. But yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. So, at present day in 2026, the demographics, if you look at the actual reports online, West Windsor is about 50% Asian, right? And West Windsor is just one small town in a greater area where there's a lot of South Asians, but 50% Asian, and a vast chunk of that 50% of Asians within West Windsor includes South Asians. And when I mean South Asians, I'm talking about not just Indians, but Sri Lankans like me and my family, people from Pakistan, people from Bangladesh, people from other countries in South Asia. If I didn't mention it, please comment down below. I'd love to hear what country in South Asia you're from. But where did this 50% of Asians come from, and how did they get here? And what specifically about this area attracted a lot of South Asians to this location? Well, I got the answers because I lived part of it. So a lot of people don't know this, and I'm going to go for a walk because my lower back hurts. Basically, it's very interesting how different immigrant groups came to America. And I'm specifically focusing on South Asians here because I'm part of that community myself. So I have a little bit of knowledge and personal, my family, my parents are immigrants from Sri Lanka. So to start with that, we have to talk about the different pathways of becoming or coming to the U.S. as an immigrant community, right? Specifically for South Asians, a lot of them were not given visas unless they were considered what you would call highly skilled workers, right? This pathway started in 1965 when the Immigrant and Nationality Act of 1965 was passed. And basically, prior to this, the amount of South Asians in the U.S. was minimal, right? Like maybe a few in California, maybe one or two in New York City, but very minimal. But after that act was passed, this pathway to citizenship for people from South Asian countries boomed. But there was a caveat. They only really allowed what they considered highly skilled workers to come to the U.S. So around 1967, the first wave of South Asians arrived in New York City. They started establishing very well-known cultural centers. One of this, as you know, is the New York Ganesha Temple. And then there was a few mosques and a few other Sikh temples I think they established, and that's when they started getting ground, right? Specifically in New York City. Now, what appealed to them was, since they worked in New York and they were working these jobs, which generated a lot of income. I'm not saying anything about, I'm not saying this in the sense of like, one race is smarter than the other. I'm just talking about they were filtered. So the H-1B1 visa for South Asian countries specifically filtered the South Asians who already were high income. It's kind of like discriminatory, but that's where the stereotype came of South Asians being smart. Anyways, so a lot of these people in New York were not redlined from buying homes in, the suburbs in New Jersey and Connecticut. So what they did was South Brunswick, West Windsor, Edison started filling up in the early 90s. And by 2000, these places were popping with a lot of South Asians. Now, I grew up in West Windsor since 1998, and I'll go into a little bit of my family history after I tell you this explanation. But when I grew up here, I would say there was a decent amount of South Asians like me. But if you look at it compared to later years, like, for example, when my younger sisters went to school, especially my youngest sister, Sweda, who's 8 years younger than me, when she was in high school, I think the elementary schools were almost all South Asian kids, right? And now, obviously, as I said, in modern day West Windsor in 2026, 50% of the town is Asian, with a large chunk of that being South Asian. Now, it's interesting because I want to backtrack a little bit to the early 90s, 2000s. So a lot of these people, again, they had disposable income. they were able to make frequent trips back to India and any other country in South Asia, except for Sri Lanka, and I'll get into that with my family history later. Because they were already here, it made it really easy for them to sponsor their family and their family friends. And again, when people heard that these suburbs like Edison, South Brunswick, West Windsor were filling up with South Asians, more South Asians came, right? And again, the South Asians who were already here frequently traveled to India, frequently traveled to Bangladesh, frequently traveled to Pakistan, not Sri Lanka. Again, get into that in a bit. And basically, they were able to tell people there, hey, apply, I'll help you, you get sponsorship. They'd tell their family back at home, and they'd also bring items and things here to start selling in shops here. So it started booming. Like from the 90s to the early 2000s, it really started popping off and booming. Specifically, obviously Edison was like the first major hub, and it still is to this day, but it also started to seep into the other surrounding suburbs in central Jersey. What's interesting is, and I want to note this, South Jersey and maybe a little bit of North Jersey was not historically South Asian until a little bit after 2010 and 2015, right? Back then, it was mainly concentrated in central Jersey or the places around, the North Jersey places that are very close to the city. The Oranges, Yonkers, certain places in Connecticut, right? Like Stamford were very strongly South Asian even back then. But now with that in mind, I'll give you a little bit of personal history because I think that really helps to seal the context, because I've been in West Windsor for a long time, like way over 20 years, probably 1998 to 2026. So that's about 28 years now. And I've seen a lot of things change. And prior to that, actually, my family lived in Brooklyn. And it's a little interesting. So I'll get into that right now. And I'll start from beginning to end and then tell you all about West Windsor and how things changed demographically over time. As I said before, my family is Sri Lankan Tamil, though a lot of Tamils from Sri Lanka would prefer I say Elam Tamil, but I'm going to say Sri Lankan Tamil because, again, it just, that's the country my family's from, where my ancestors are from. And as you know, in Sri Lanka, if you don't know, there was a civil war. And I'll talk more about this as, going into my childhood in West Windsor, but there was a civil war, so my family had to flee. My father's side basically fled to wherever they could. 5 of his siblings went to Sydney, Australia. 2 of them went to Europe. 1 lived in London. The other moved around a bunch before ending up in London very much later. My mom's side was all in Toronto, Canada. All of my mom's siblings, my mom's sister, her 3 brothers, and my maternal grandparents were all in Toronto. They went there probably mid 80s when the war really broke out in Sri Lanka. So eventually my parents had me. I was 6 months old in Colombo, Sri Lanka when they left, and they went to Toronto. And when I was 2 years old, my parents matched for the residency in Brooklyn. And we all came, and then, I was between Toronto because my parents couldn't take care of me when I was that young because they were in their residency. And I was between Toronto and, Brooklyn, right? So eventually in 1998, we moved down from Brooklyn and we came to West Windsor. First lived at Avalon Watch. Then in 2000, we moved to Southfield Meadows. And what's interesting is I was actually between when things were changing. So when I first arrived in Avalon Watch, for 2 years, I went to Maurice Hawk Elementary School. And when I moved to our house in Southfield Meadows, back then, Village was actually a lower elementary school. So Village was K to 3, right? And what is now Millstone River was the upper elementary school, 4th and 5th grade, where everybody, not just kids from Plainsboro or not just kids, for every single upper elementary school student was in Millstone River. I went to Millstone in 4th grade. Then I went back to Village for upper elementary school when they changed it. Obviously went to Grover for 6th grade since I grew up behind Grover, and went to West Windsor Plainsboro High School South, right? So what's interesting to note is I just remember growing up, when we first moved down to West Windsor in 1998, the first 2 kids I met, I'll never forget, Sai Shaharat or Sai Gudamela, still talk to him to this day, and then another kid named Zorath. He was Pakistani, Sai was Indian, I was Sri Lankan. We all hung out, we did stuff together, we went around. It was really cool, right? So I grew up with Sai, I grew up with Zarath. They were the first two kids I met, and prior to this in Brooklyn, like we had a lot of Indian friends, but I had a lot of like other friends too, right? But South Asian, because Zarath was Pakistani. But after first grade, I think Zarath went back to Pakistan, then Sai moved somewhere else, and I wouldn't see him for a bit. I'd have to, my family would have to drop me off to go play with him wherever he was later on. So I mainly grew up with a bunch of just white Spanish kids in Avalon Watch before we moved to Southfield Meadows. And what's interesting is in Southfield Meadows, my cul-de-sac was very multicultural. So we were the Sri Lankan family. Next door was the Juliuses, a Jewish white family. Then the Wu family, who were Asian. Then the Kumars, who are Indian. Another Indian family. And then some neighbors. I actually forgot their name, but I think they were like Russian white or something. And the rest of my neighborhood was mostly Indians and mostly white, right? So when I went to school from elementary school, as I said, I would say there was probably like 3 or 4 Indian kids in every elementary school class, right? And then obviously when we went to Grover, there was a bunch more. And the upperclassmen, SASA was a thing back then too. We had the South Asian Student Alliance Club, even when I was a kid in like early 2000s. And I think we sponsored a few Sri Lankan families, right? One of them went to South, and we had a few family friends in town who were also friends of my parents back in Sri Lanka, where they grew up in Jaffna. And I think by the time I reached high school, I remember, it was people were coming in from India, not to the level they are today in 2026, but I think this was I went to high school in South from 2006 to 2010. So there was already people coming in from India all the time, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, transferring into our school district halfway through the year or to the end of the year. And people were already going back to India for 2 years and then coming back to West Windsor South in their junior year, which was a really interesting phenomenon to watch, right? And obviously, it was interesting because, there were people who came and just straight up spoke Punjabi or Hindi or Tamil or Telugu and stuff. And they didn't really know much English, or they knew English, but it was like a very accented English. It was really cool, right, to see all this growing up. One notable thing is, and I want to say this, I grew up playing ball at Grover, right? These courts I've been balling at since 2000, right? And me and my boys and me and my neighborhood friends and just a bunch of kids would always pull up here and ball. And as I said, I balled with a wide variety of people, right? Most of them were my neighborhood friends, so they were Asian, East Asian, a few Indian kids, South Asians, a bunch of other kids in my neighborhood. But what was interesting was a lot of my friends who I balled with, a lot of my boys were Pakistani, right? And I learned a lot about the immigration pathways from Pakistan. And what I learned is there was apparently a civil war in Pakistan where certain people in Pakistan were persecuted and they came here on an emergency visa, right? And actually, what's interesting is that's very similar to what happened to Sri Lankans, right? Because a lot of Sri Lankan Tamils specifically, because the war was against us, it was basically a genocide in Sri Lanka. A lot of Sri Lankans came to Toronto, right? Because Toronto opened up a pathway to refugees. Toronto opened a huge amount of refugee visas for Sri Lankans and anybody who was persecuted, right? So a lot of these Sri Lankans from Toronto would actually get a full citizenship there, then apply for a visa to New York. And the ones who had master's degrees and stuff would often get it much easier than just doing it straight up from, the South Asian country they're from, right? Which I found very interesting. I didn't really know that as a kid, but I found that out later. And here's the other funny thing. So remember earlier how I said that basically, man, I'm all over the place now, but remember how I said earlier that Sri Lankans did not really travel back to Sri Lanka, but Pakistani people in West Windsor, Indians in West Windsor, Bangladeshis in West Windsor would often go back to their countries for the whole summer and chill there for the whole summer, bring back items, sell it in shops and do that. Sri Lankans didn't really get to do that because when I was a kid, the Civil War was still going on. I mean, nowadays they do, but in my time, they weren't, right? When I was in Grover, the tsunami, I literally remember going to Sri Lanka for the first time since I was born there when I was 12 years old in 6th grade in the summer of 2004. And that was the first time because there was a ceasefire. And then months after that, when I was in 7th grade during winter break, the tsunami broke out and my parents went back there and helped. And then the war resumed in full-fledged wartime. And then in 2009, there was the war ended, the Tigers were defeated. Tamil people were put in basically concentration camps throughout the northeast of Sri Lanka. And we had a year of mourning, which they didn't host any events for, which I strongly disagree with, by the way, that the New Jersey and the New York Sri Lankan Tamil community did. But we never had a chance to go to our country growing up. And I used to find it so interesting that my Desi friends, right, my South Asian friends, all used to go home. They'd spend entire summers in India, and I would not do that, right? Like my family, we'd go to London, right? We'd go to Toronto, we'd go to like all these other places, but we never went back to Sri Lanka for years, right? I think the next time my family got to visit Sri Lanka was 2014 when I was a senior in college. And I actually went in 2023, but it really is interesting how different South Asians have different experiences, even though they're a diaspora living in an area like this in West Windsor, right? But yeah, going back to the courts, because this is like interesting, right? So I remember growing up and being in the South Asian community. As I said, a lot of my friends were Pakistani, right? The guys I would ball with who would come to the courts were Pakistani. So what's really interesting about South Asian culture in West Windsor is you're very interfaith, right? I mean, I remember during Ramadan, I would play with my boys, and I was raised Hindu, but a lot of them would come here, and sometimes it would be in the summer when Ramadan was going on. They wouldn't eat anything all day. Like there was a dude who was studying for his MCATs. He'd study for his MCATs all day in Plainsboro Library. Homeboy would come back here at 6. And remember, in the summer, the sun doesn't go down till like 8:30. He'd play in the heat with no water, no food, nothing. And a lot of my Pakistani friends who are Islamic did that. And I was like, yo, like that is tough, boy. Like that's some awesome stuff, right? And I remember after that, we'd all go to a place called Zach Burgers or anything where it was halal, and they'd just have a feast, right? They'd break the fast with some dates. They'd bring dates here. And that's just like one of the really cool interfaith, intercultural things I experienced growing up in this community, right? It's like, it was all through basketball, right? And then I learned, a lot about Bangladesh, right? I learned a lot about, certain parts of India, right? There's like 16 or more plus different ways to cook chicken biryani. And all of the people I played ball with would tell me about like the different chicken biryanis, right? And again, I'm from Sri Lanka. So like we have different things that I would teach them about. And it was really interesting because there was a lot of, even amongst the South Asian community, there was so much variety, so much difference. And it was all here in West Windsor, right? We were all just South Asian kids, first generation immigrants. Our parents were immigrants, but we grew up here, American as apple pie. But hearing the stories from our parents or extended family, and we would just, tell each other about it, which I just like, it was so amazing. And obviously I do that with my white friends, my East Asian friends, my Spanish friends, my African American friends, my, all my other friends. We talk about that. We do that. But I found it so beautiful and interesting. And even as an adult, like I'm amazed by it, right? Like growing up, we all bonded here in these courts all this time, and to this day we still do, and I just love it. I just love that culture exchange. So that's just a little bit about the how South Asians came to be in West Windsor, and how it is. And I find something else very incredible and interesting is now they're growing up beside all these other cultures, and we're all mixing, which is great, right? We're all exchanging ideas. We're all becoming one strong community, right? So we're not just South Asians anymore. We're also Americans, and we're citizens of the world because we travel across the world and everything. So I love it. I love it so much. And thanks for watching.